And there we go. We are now officially being recorded. So good day again, everyone. I am Tom Fisher. For those of you who don't know me, we'll be discussing right now distributed gaming. And I know immediately after this session there will be a breakout room where the only man who could miss a bug under his desk lamp during a mega game, Mr. C. Stephen Downs Martin will be chairing a room on distributed wargaming, and there will also be a breakout room on sensitive issues in games and how they will be and how they could be best gamed out in order to respect everyone who is playing. So that'll come up immediately after the session. Peter Pellegrino, Louise Hurl, I hope I pronounced that correctly, or close enough. And Emily Robinson will be coming up and speaking. Certainly people who don't need a complete introduction, but Rex Brynan will be putting their bios into the chat. At least part of their bios, because they could certainly be as long as each of our arms with all of the experience that they bring to the table. Which brings us to me and what it is that I do. I'm the president of Imagineetic, and Imagineetic is a private concern, much like Matt Stevens before, so that we have, our own purposes as well, being here certainly. And I'm based in Montreal, have worked with Rex on many a project. I think the one that brought me the most pride was the development of the Smuggy, and certainly it is the favorite of Rex's, but having put together with Rex Aftershock, Rex and Tom Moat, the Magic Kit, worked with Matt Stevens and a number of people from my team as well. Brianna Persiviat, who is here and now famously at the Joint Warfare Center, on the research project of serious games in the humanitarian world. We are very proud to support the Derby House rules, both internally and externally. A very important piece of our culture corporately is the to be inclusive, and quite frankly, it is not only good from a PR perspective, it is fabulous for business and creating games, because you get far better results by including more people. To that end, our very own mascot, Mr. Smuggy, is a proud supporter of the Derby House rules as well. Further to this, for the students here or the participants who work with academics and in academia, Imagineetic does sponsor the Imagineetic Diversity in Games bursary, a $1,000 Canadian bursary going to any student internationally who is interested in studying and furthering games, either currently pursuing or about to pursue serious games as part of their academic career. Please get in touch with Rex or myself. My email address is above, and we can point you in the right direction and or get you the forms to fill that out. As a bit of a plug, because we've had a number of our esteemed panelists here at Connections who have actually taken my Legend course, the Imagineetic course for game design and facilitation. This is open to any and all who are interested, and any Connections North attendees. If you use the code Connections North, you'll be getting a 25% discount. This goes to any students as well, and we can certainly work out a special student rate. That being said, the reason we're here, or at least the reason I'm here, is because as much as I do have a technical background, as much as I am familiar with computers and running distributed games for fun, over platforms like Roll20. I was of the very fundamental belief that tabletop is just better. You get that connection. And then this happened. Specifically with regard to the course that was delivered, the Legend course that was developed and then offered to people at Global Affairs Canada, and then grew from there to include NGOs, different government departments, people from Europe and the United States have joined the course. Because it was supposed to be face-to-face, and we were going to have a wonderful conference room and lunch and coffee, and it was going to be spectacular and fancy, and this. And something that was supposed to happen last year turned into late last year because there was no way we were going to get together. So COVID forced our hand, and in the midst of this, I was also working on a particular big project for a client, one of the UN agencies. And then it was a matter of, what the heck do you do? I've got this project. I'm supposed to be traveling to Europe, ideally in September, to deliver this. Now we're not allowed to travel. What's the next step? And this is where we brought in a little bit of the outside the box thinking. What are we going to do, particularly with humanitarians who are not necessarily used to gaming in the first place, certainly not at a serious level like this, and then further, not used to gaming certainly online. And so we had to force playtests that were going to occur face-to-face into an online environment. And then we can't wait until September in order to be able to move forward and deliver this training, because we had people who were going to be in the field in April and desperately needed to go through this training. So what we were going to do, we had to build a whole new construction set. Now, what we thought was going to be tabletop exercise turning into a hybrid based on a whole lot of experience of wargaming, as wargaming with Rex and Ben in an educational or casual sense, and then trying to step that into a more serious structured game, which turned into a semi-success but a bit of a confused mess. And largely it was because the end user did not necessarily have a familiarity with all of the tools in order to be able to properly execute the training. So when you're stuck in a situation like that, we play tested it a few times. Great discussions were coming out of it. Fabulous insights and ideas were coming out of it, but they couldn't quite execute the game because there was too much jumping around. So we went to a fully virtual model backed up by standard office communications. Right now we're using Zoom, but it can be done with Teams, could be done with Discord. But the crux of the game has gone fully digital. Now, we've had great success with playtesting that now. And the lessons learned from that in particular really are that from the outset, especially now, because we're not in a pre-COVID and post-COVID world, everything's going to go back to normal. I think we can all agree to a certain extent that we're in the, well, we're always going to have to prepare for the next COVID and the next event. And since now we're starting to get used to virtual, and it seems to be cheaper to do it because we're not flying people around the world, how do we step forward? The only thing that I can counsel from the get-go is think digital. That when developing a game, that is going to be broadly used to really uh, get to the end result. In the app world, we will say think mobile. You know, think of that end result, because mobile is so pervasive. Digital, virtual is going to be that pervasive moving forward. There can be tremendous advantages to this. You can deliver across the world if you're willing to either be awake and you're facilitating it, or let the app out into the wild and allow it to run freely. But there are horrible, horrible drawbacks if done improperly, especially when you run into the scenario where you let an app out into the wild and then you are teaching the wrong thing or guiding people in the wrong direction, because there's no one to be able to pull back and guide you, if you will, with any wrong assumptions. And that is certainly something that is quite dangerous potentially moving forward. So it has to be really a consideration when developing now this new distributed landscape. That's something on the wargaming side certainly far more mature, because users are far more used to this. In the humanitarian world, this is a tool that is used far less, and so the familiarity is not there, and they cannot necessarily take advantage of the benefits, and the developers are not necessarily up on the way to whether teach the correct lessons in the correct way using a digital format, or the ability to design things in such an effective way. So with that, we're going to talk about going digital, and I am going to commit the cardinal sin of presentations, and I am going to do a live demonstration. This is on a platform that we have used, and we're using our Imagineetic conductor space right here. And this is how we have transformed what was this hybrid game into a game that is fully run digitally. It is great because it encapsulates it. You know what I'm trying to say. It takes most of your messaging other than voice and keeps it out of the normal business stream. For example, your messaging and your email, bringing it into this package, merged with all sorts of multimedia, be they news reports, phone calls, walkie-talkie, so that you get a full experience as if you were sitting in your office and whatever situation, crisis is going on around you, because this is really built for crisis management. So what I'm going to do just quickly, I'm going to log into the system here. And yes, I logged in correctly, so that means the live portion worked. And very simply, we have a scenario here set up for a UN agency dealing with providing relief to refugee and internally displaced persons camps. What I'm going to do here is very quickly run through what probably would be 2 hours in less than a minute, just to demonstrate how it is that things happen. First, we have a timer that pops up, letting everybody know you only have so much time. On our map, we have a counter showing where there is movement. Oh no, a phone call is coming in from MONUSCO, which is a UN security force, and it is beeping in my ear. I'm going to push to answer this.
Aid workers.
And I'm going to call that off. Oh no, now I'm getting a phone call that I have to answer. But you know what? I'm going to reject that. I'm not going to answer that question. In the meantime, I've got news that has popped up. My email mailbox is getting full. Oh no, now I've had movement of displaced persons going on. Do keep in mind this is going to take place over 2 hours. This is just the accelerated version. But we have an entire mail system in the background that can be handled and will handle attachments going back and forth. So this is as if they are in full on business mode. From there, attachments can be opened. You're going back and forth, checking other mail messages. Different messages will come up, and there's a whole slew of different channels that we can use for that communication mechanism. So not only moving around a board, but we're also dealing with the messages that are going back and forth, being able to actually instruct your teams to move around independently on your side of things, and it just grows and grows and grows. And behind all of this is a very robust system that I can't 100% get into because of my agreement with the UN agency, where you can get into whole assessments of when people are answering. Are they answering? You can queue up all kinds of different questions that they must deal with. Are they making this shipment? Is this moving this or that way? All of this we were able to pivot in a month. So, lesson learned, you have to be really, really agile. Really agile, especially in this sphere now and with the change. With that now under our belt, we have lots of opportunities to be able to exploit the digital space more and more and keep it as a focus. Again, the idea of if we're going to design something digitally, think digital first, because it's a lot easier to take a digital thinking game, if you will, and adapt tabletop than the other way around necessarily. That being said, when designing a game, any sort of game, digital or not, you should be starting on a piece of paper and you should be designing that game first, right? But digitally. Think of it digitally. Even if it's your post-it notes, think about the digital connections that you are making to guide you through. And in keeping with every game designer's number one secret, the absolute greatest thing that you can do is somebody's probably done it before. It might not be exactly what you want, but there are pieces that you can steal across the board. There are platforms that are out there that you can adapt. And if you have the wherewithal, the capabilities to do that, then you can be very agile and be able to move forward. So, what are the next steps? For us, our next steps are fully digital games, where now we have, this is a prototype of a game that we are looking at to deal with a particular bid. But if that bid does not come through, we're going to build it anyway, quite frankly, because we see tremendous capability there. In the course that I'm delivering, we started to have a discussion about the interest and the issues that a lot of people from Global Affairs, from Agriculture Canada, did not necessarily have the exposure to games, especially serious games. Something that, that Rex, I think he gets some credit for, but I don't think he gets enough credit for in our little world, is really bringing games to people that are, beyond being good, thoughtful games, accessible. And being able to get that out into the market to get people thinking this way. And so as part of that, we're starting a game club in April where we are going to run through people's games. They can bring their own games. We will run our games. Doesn't matter. It's about getting the ideas out into the market. Learning good game design practices. Both, again, that idea of think digital, so you're preparing yourself, when you're getting your game going and pushing the perceived envelope. People think that it is more difficult than it is on the one hand. On the other hand, there are pieces they think are a little bit too easy. But it is not so difficult as long as you have a good guide. That starts with connections. So many of the people here, Rex Brynan, teachers that are out there, Moores. The Moores courses are fantastic. Joint Warfare Center internally in Canada is running going to be running their game series. I've got my game series. I know Matt Stevens is running a game series in Jordan for humanitarians. All of this is fundamental and so very important as we move things forward. With that, I've hopefully kept that brief enough, because we have very many more interesting people than me on this panel. And so please post your questions continually in the chat, and we will get to them afterwards. But right now, a man who in this genre really doesn't need an introduction, Mr. Peter Pellegrino, could you please take it away?
Okay. Thanks. So my comments, I'm going to be relatively brief. Rex asked me not necessarily to rehash the distributed gaming taxonomy from last time. And that's why I said, yeah, so I don't have any slides to share. However, as I was listening and I was looking at the attendees, I thought, well, maybe I ought to just make one quick slide. So I will recap just ever so briefly the taxonomy that I talked about at Connections Global last year. And then I'll talk about kind of where, at least for the Naval War College, where I do most of my gaming efforts, where we've gone and where we haven't gone in terms of a year of digital gaming, or actually the lack thereof, honestly. So I'll just as a kind of as a quick refresher, I'm going to share the screen. This is from a talk I gave last year. You can track it down if you have not seen this on PAX-Sim side, or you can also find it on tabletophistory.net. That's my website. You can find this talk as well on distributed gaming. And the genesis of this was, back up a year ago, as we were talking about moving into distributed environment as forced upon us by COVID. I realized that oftentimes my colleagues and I were talking past each other because we did not have a shared or a shared way of talking about what do you mean by distribution. And so after a couple of conversations and some quick notes scribbled down on a damp napkin, I kind of threw together these 4 features that seem to be least common to the types of games that the college was considering looking at and doing in a distributed environment. And that was this idea first of understanding that when we talk about distribution, there's a geographic separation component. Okay? In terms of, we could have everything from individuals sitting at home alone in front of their own individual laptops, dozens of them scattered, or maybe they're at a handful of sites where we've got maybe 5 people at this location, 5 people in another location, 3 people someplace else, 5 people. And so they're kind of starting to clump. We called it clustering. And then finally, you basically have everyone co-located, which is essentially a face-to-face experience. So that was the geographic component or the geographic feature that we talk about. And then there's a time element in terms of, well, when we said distribution, like for example, and this is kind of what made me start doing this, as soon as we started talking distribution, I was saying, well, yeah, people could be, alone or together. One of my colleagues said, oh no, that's not what I mean. And he was thinking about this portion here, time distribution in the system, in terms of, is everyone playing whenever they want? There's no need that everyone needs to be online at the same time. You can get online, you can do your thing, you can send in your move as long as it's done by Tuesday, kind of thing. So people are all working at independent times at potentially different locations. And then we had the middle model, which was the staggered model, which essentially said, well, most of the time you're on your own, but for the purposes of synchronizing or potentially doing some sort of plenary activity or otherwise briefing everyone at the same time, some portion of your individual window overlaps in a common time window. And then we've got where we're all together all the time, or together synchronously, which is typically what you think about in a face-to-face environment. So those were 2 scales that slid along, and you could be distributed, geographically isolated, working synchronously, asynchronously. You could be clustered, working staggered. but that gave us a way to kind of to put a finer point on when you say distribution, what do you mean? Then there was a part where, at least for those of us working in the classified realm, this issue of classification became its own problem set on top of the distribution challenges of just having people scattered around the planet in different time zones at different times in different locations. And it was more about the fact that as soon as we began to talk classification, the access to networked facilities at the appropriate level of security changed dramatically. And when we're getting all together and we all have the right top secret security clearance, it's relatively easy for us to game at the college. We've got facilities that were made for very high levels of security. As a matter of fact, that had become kind of the de jour game, is the top secret and above highly compartmentalized, highly classified games at the college. It almost became kind of our selling point. How do we distinguish ourselves from other gaming facilities? We can do top secret, double probation type of gaming. However, when that becomes your stock and trade, you find out that you cannot distribute that very easily because there just aren't either the facilities where people can gather, back to the how humans clump, because if they do have a terminal which has access to that classified network, odds are it's stuffed in a very small room off of an ops center, and 2 people maybe can get into that room at a time. Doesn't exactly support clustered type of activities. Then finally, this idea of what exactly are you using for tool sets? Early on, when we kind of got thrust into this, we found that there wasn't a ton of dedicated distributed gaming stuff on the military high side, if you will. There's always been stuff like D20, Tabletop Simulator, Vassal. For the commercial side work, there were no equivalents that we had quick, easy access to that were tried and true on some of these very secure networks. And so we were having to throw stuff together using what was already there in terms of, okay, how do we leverage a Microsoft Office suite? How do we take advantage of a chat feature that was already present on that network, et cetera? And again, what we had become used to at the college was working on our own enclosed network, dedicated system that we had complete control over. And all of these things then represent challenges as we then try to do distribution. So how did all of that work out? I'd like to come back and say, well, after a year of doing this, had a few rough starts, but then, wow, we got our act together and it worked out great. It didn't. So this is where we're still struggling, right? And part of what I realized perhaps that I should have added to this distribution thing is we think about those factors and in addressing distribution geography, distribution time elements, tool sets and whatnot, it is in many cases driven this to a technology discussion. How do we have the tech that enables this? And what we ran into is that while we can in oft cases get past the technology problem, we ran into the human problem. And that we just had different types of clients and sponsors who were used to a type of game, had comes from a variety of backgrounds. I don't want to be just overly generalized and say, well, you know, it's the old senior officers just can't play on a computer and the young millennials ate this up. No, it wasn't quite that clean. The buckets weren't quite that clean. Certainly younger officers and younger folks that I've gamed with, they have their learning curve much quicker, much more comfortable, and seem to have jumped on and into some of these games better than some of our more senior personnel. But I don't know if this is in their defense or not. Many of the more senior personnel were also used to gaming in situations where, yes, they came to the game and they also brought along 3 captains and a commander. And when it came time to actually touch a keyboard, to actually put a move into a game system, what they were happy to go to the council of commanders and think big thoughts and provide direction, but they always turn to the 06 to actually touch the keyboard because they don't do that, right? They're not going to fill out the move sheet. Suddenly, I put them in an isolated situation in front of a laptop at headquarters without their little gang around them. We ran into challenges. We also ran into probably the single biggest challenge that impacted this was the classification issue. And the the reluctance of commands which had become somewhat addicted to gaming, but very high classification levels and the type of information that you can gain access to when you're in those environments, did not see value in going down several steps. Could we have learned something interesting in an unclassed environment? I think so. it was difficult to convince the sponsor, having fed him this constant feed of highly classified information. Now to say, look, we could potentially do this in a distributed environment. However, we're only going to do it at the secret level. It was like, really? That's all? I don't know if we're interested. So we only have a couple of data points over the past year. The college has been very reluctant because of the highly classified work we've been doing to really push into distribution. So this human element of how well are humans positioned to engage in a Zoom environment over a period of time? Do they need to have others around them? Is isolation absolutely the wrong approach for certain officers in certain situations? What we ended up doing was taking a game. Many of our games got basically canceled or postponed into 2021. The games are of such of a nature that no one was interested in discussing this in a distributed format. So, okay, punt. We did have a game that was already designed that was ready for a face-to-face experience. We tried to wedge that into a distributed environment. Not terribly satisfying. And part of our challenge is that our games tend to generate reams of data that we go into a month to 2 month analysis period. And again, people have become used to getting those types of reports out of the War College. And so in order to do that, we had to start sending people downrange. Now, as part of the distribution plan was that, okay, we think we can go clustered, a couple of key nodes in terms of in like Washington and maybe in Hawaii for the Pacific Command to play. But we had to send out our own analysts to those locations to be able to directly observe what was happening at those remote sites. That helped, certainly. But I think the general feeling after that event was kind of like, nah, it wasn't as tasty as it had been in years past. The next solution has been to push through and basically ignore the issue and figure out, okay, if it's COVID and that's the problem, are there health mitigations that we can do, socially distancing, masking people up, testing them beforehand, what percentage have already been vaccinated, and we're going to bring them to the college. So we've almost just forced our way past the necessity of distribution. Everyone thought that this was going to be the great moment where, oh, finally, those of us who saw utility in distributed gaming pre-COVID and couldn't get a foot in the door thought COVID was going to be that grand entrance. And now, COVID's going to force us to be distributed. Well, actually, I found out that I can be waited out. Okay, that really we can still avoid this if you're willing to just drag your feet long enough. And I know that I'm saying I'm being critical of the college, but it is a function of the types of work we do and the types of games we've played. Now, other stuff I've been doing in a distributed environment, mostly unclassed with students, has been great. And we've had fantastic opportunities to run games that in the past we would not have had the opportunity to do. And distribution has by far given us greater access to audiences and to students that otherwise would never have gotten the opportunity to play some of these war games that we've done for undergraduates. And as a matter of fact, I've got a game coming up here next month that we're going to be doing for the U.S. Naval Academy that in a pre-distributed world would not have been something that anyone would have considered having pulled off. It would have been yeah, that's too bad we're not busy, you're a low priority, and we don't have the tools for it, but we do now. So I guess all of this is kind of that cautionary tale is that on one hand, there have been bright, shiny examples of this working. And I think we need to continue to work the tool sets to improve this. But in the end, all of this is a human experience, and we can't ignore that human layer to this problem in terms of how do we get the engagement. In the end, I always go back to player engagement as being my magic metric that I have to think about for gaming. And I don't care whether we're talking about gaming over a in-play, face-to-face board game, we're doing some sort of face-to-face computer system inside of McCarty Little Hall at the college, we're doing something writ large. It's about the engagement component. So it doesn't matter whether the technology is there for the distribution function, or in this case, we're also discussing looking at different wargaming tools within the building. And when I hear that the only way to get player engagement for millennials is to give them 3D virtual environments and I need holograms, otherwise they're, quote, not engaged, I go back to my overgeneralized statement is it's not about creating fun, and don't think that they expect that environment. I've got my own kids, when they grew up, Yes, they played Call of Duty endlessly. Yes, they were networked with their buddies, but they spent actually more time playing board games with their friends than they did in the virtual environment. And now that they're grown and out of the house, they're still doing board gaming with their friends. So this idea that this opportunity of COVID and distribution was going to magically align with the expectation of younger audiences for digital experiences, I think is an overstatement. Continue to look for the engagement opportunities. Many tools can create engagement. I've reduced senior enlisted folks to tiers using three boards of a board game and a set of walkie-talkies. Right? And they were crying, yelling, screaming, and cursing at each other by the time the event was over. I think they were engaged, okay? And I didn't need to create a very elaborate virtual environment to do that. So I think we just need to be much more cognizant of the human component in the distributed environment now. And I know that if you've got background in online education, you're going to be sitting there listening to me saying, "Oh, well, welcome to the party. You're years too late." In terms of, yes, there are folks who have been thinking deeply about how do we create engagement in online for education purposes. And I think at least from the college's perspective and the wargaming perspective, there's a lot we can take away from those folks that is more than just figuring out whether you should be using, which software platform to support your distribution. So those are my thoughts. I'm anxious to answer your questions and hear my other colleagues talk.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, definitely hear everything you're saying there. But you wrote the book on the matter, so it certainly helps. It helps when you could literally say that, right? But your point is exceedingly well taken about just because it looks pretty don't mean it's good. But boy, oh boy, do a lot of people put too much faith in the fact that it's got to look pretty, and they assume that must be quality, and just so often not the case. With that, we shall switch things over to my partner in rodent crime, Louise Hurl, with her discussion. Go ahead, Louise. All yours.
Okay, let me just swap my screen over. Okay, so you should be seeing a boring NCIA slide. So I'm Louise, I'm from NATO, the Operational Analysis Service Line. So you'll notice straight away, I am not technically a wargamer. I'm an operational analyst that dabbles. And today I'm going to tell you some work we did creating a research paper on reflections on distributed wargaming for defense. So straight away, let me say, everyone else has been telling you about their own experiences. I'm going to tell you about everyone else's. So last summer, so towards the, when we were still probably in the first lockdown, there was a perception that everyone around, all the wargamers, started trying distribution, and there was lots of activity going on. There were various articles coming out, and so we were going to collect people's experiences. So we identified wargamers through the NATO SAS network, and that's the Systems Analysis and Studies. For those of you who don't know, Sue introduced it earlier today, in case you were paying attention. And we found a selection of people that had been, suddenly forced due to the pandemic, sent home, and now we're now trying to do distributed wargaming, recognizing that this is not new to some people, but new to a lot of people. So we found a group of people, and we did about 11 structured interviews and read a whole host of supporting reports and articles. And this was all done virtually, obviously. And many of the people you've heard today, well, not many, but quite a few we spoke to. So I spoke to Peter and Rex, and then Murray, who was on yesterday, and Anya, who was on earlier. And we took all their experiences and asked them about their recent experiences having to do distributed gaming, and we collected and summarized those into a series of reflections. So that will be published as part of a SAS 139, which is the analytical wargaming body that analytical wargaming SAS panel, and that will be released later this year. And they are reflections. So they're reflections because it's not a comprehensive look across the whole of NATO by any means. And it was just those people that were happy and willing to talk to us, and everyone was very generous with their time. It's not a lessons because we don't know the answers to a lot of things, and I'll show you some of those towards the end of this presentation. And we deliberately didn't sanitize it. So where we didn't know, we didn't say. And there were a number of areas where people also had differences of opinions, and we left those in. So what did we find? So the paper is a little bit longer than I can cover today. We did find 27 reflections. I'm only going to cover some of them for you. So let's start at the top with the game design and the characteristics. Some of the reflections are quite obvious. So let's start with something like that. Simple game designs were found to run remotely much more easy. You have to remember, lots of people were forced into this. So suddenly they had a game and they were trying to make it into something they could run remotely or virtually in some sort of form. So they were choosing the easier ones. They were making them, they were simplifying what they had rather than developing new ones to start off with. And they were choosing ones that had simple rule sets and that had less complex interfaces. There were issues with if there were very small icons that people couldn't see if they were suddenly having to do something on an iPad, for example. So that was a nice, easy one to start with. The next one, you'll also, come as no surprise, large group dynamics don't work as well virtually. You can't have, 50 people all talking at once, especially in some of the simple online systems that were being used at the start. One person said, shouting works best when you're all physically in the same room. So that was one observation. People were trying to apply matrix games and they were finding, okay, the same thing you do at the end with the large syndicate is not working. Where you can't have a large plenary, you have to have a series of smaller syndicates and then come back together and then talk. The next one was just wonderfully talked about by Peter, thankfully, with a slightly different take, the classification. We were looking mainly at the defense environments. We were mainly looking at analytical wargaming. What classification you're running at is a big deal, not just because of the system, but also the appetite for risk. What we were finding was some organizations were much more willing to declassify something and run it at a lower level of classification and learn things than others were. Some people just said no. That's something that Peter was just ably talking about. I'll just give you another example on the technology. They were quickly adapting things. There was one organization that already had cameras linked in their gaming room so they could actually broadcast over the VTC and run it at a classified level. Another one that was already going to run a game at an unclassified level, they hooked up cameras, but they were kind of banned. They're saying, no, even if it's completely unclassified, we're not going to run that over the internet. So the appetite for risk just cancelled it out. And on facilitation and gaming and gameplay, we talked about facilitation a lot. Lots of facilitators, you read the room, you look at your visual clues, you look at your social clues, and they were just not there. And it was a big, sharp learning curve for many facilitators to try and run virtually. There was also a perception that you would need some stronger or more robust facilitation. And often that meant more facilitation rather than one person, especially an experienced facilitator being able to command a whole room and see where their attention was required. Once it was virtual and there were much more smaller digital rooms, they may require, one facilitator per room, and they were having to add extra facilitation there. Enabling tools and technology. Now this one, I know everyone wants to know what's the magic, what's the best tool to use, what's the one that's great. I don't know, just so you know, just lay that out there. What we did learn was the technical burden on participants was kept to a minimum. We have to remember we were looking at this last summer, so a lot of people were trying to adapt very quickly. They were picking up free tools or very tools that could be used by everyone, so on any platform, and they were having to go down to the lowest common denominator so that all the participants could do that. That made it easy to start off with, but as they wanted to develop, they would quickly became a limiting factor on tools. So that was a slight problem. There was also a lot of learning in this area, especially about testing. You need to test. Even if you think it's going to work, you need to test. There was a lovely example where they were running game, and it was across two government departments, or 2 or 3 government departments. They had exactly the same platform. They had they all thought they would be able to talk to each other. They do normally, but they had different configurations for the same tool, and that became an insurmountable barrier. And they had to give up on connectivity in that way in the end. But testing, and a bit more testing came up. There was even many discussed if they were really lucky. Having a dedicated technical support person was a great idea if you had the time, resources, and money, which many people did not. So on resources, time, and money, we're going to touch on this in a minute. Most people found that playing distributed games takes longer. The ballpark was twice as long, but we're going to talk about that in a minute because we're not exactly sure what we're comparing there. And then there was costs. So when you start to think about costs, you think, okay, so if everyone's staying at home, I don't have to rent a facility space. I don't have to pay for travel. I don't have to pay for hotels, no coffee, no biscuits. It's probably easier going to be to capture information because I can just record and I don't need note takers. But then you start to think, okay, maybe I need to have a completely different game design. So I'm starting from scratch. I'm probably going to need extra technical support. I've got software, I've got tools and licenses. And it quickly becomes a little bit unclear as to whether it's actually cheaper or not cheaper. So the reflection we came up with is a bit of a cop-out. We decided, well, costs may fall differently. We're not exactly sure if that makes it more or less cost effective yet, but I'm sure somebody will decide in the end. And then the next one I'm going to cover again in a minute, but collaboration. So everyone has always had the opportunity to collaborate and to have increased participation and work across the globe, etc. But we haven't always. And there was definitely a feel from the people we were talking to that they had started to collaborate more during the development of distributed games caused by the pandemic. And I'm not sure why that is, whether it's extra time or just reaching out more because they were at home or feeling that everyone was a bit closer in this digital world. But there was definitely an increased collaboration and participation going on. So some of the things that, some of the questions that kind of left us with after we'd written all our reflections, I'm going to leave you with these 3 and I'm sure we'll have questions on them later. One is distributed a completely new genre of wargaming, or is it just another design consideration? It's clearly a very important factor up front in how you're going in your game design. And distributed does have, or is distributed just another layer on top of your already all the things you're going to consider for your gaming anyway. And I'm not sure where I fall on that. And the second one is about time. So there was definitely a perception that, well, from let's say 80% of the people we talked to, that distributed wargamings were taking longer. But is this really a general constraint? Is this a product of the logistic hurdles and the cultural lags and the technological learning curve, giving a different experience? How much of this is colouring people's times? And are we really comparing apples and apples? If we had started from a blank sheet of paper and designed a game on the same topic, one distributed and one not distributed, and played them, would we get the same results? And then also, what are we comparing? If I suddenly don't have to drive 2 hours to Brussels, can I add that on my extra time and count that within my time for the game because I don't now have to do it? So the whole point on whether or not distributed games take longer or same amount of time or shorter is out for debate, I would say. And lastly, the pandemic. I saw lots more collaboration going on. It's a touch of irony that COVID, which meant we all had to socially distance and stay apart, in that we saw more collaboration, and that was across countries, that was across within the same country where it's geographically large, you know, such as Canada, perhaps not the Netherlands where I am, and pulling from also because it was virtual, a lot of the games were being run unclassified. So they had more interest in bringing in some SMEs and academics at an unclassified level to participate in the game that perhaps they would not have been able to had the game been played at a higher classification. And so I really was pleased to hear greater collaboration. I think that's a great thing, but I don't know how we can maintain that going forward. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to talk about as well. And with that, if you want any further details on any of the other things that we found, we can even provide probably a copy of the paper if you're so interested, with the appropriate caveats because it's not yet released, then please get in touch. And with that, I will hand back to you, Tom.
Thank you so very much. I had to remember to take myself off of mute, which will make Emily very happy because it's a perfect segue to her first slide, I know. With that, we shall pass things along to Canada's own Emily Robinson to guide us next. Go ahead, Emily.
Great, thank you. Okay. So yes, as Tom mentioned, I am Emily Robinson. I'm with Defense Research and Development Canada in the Centre for Operational Research and Analysis. Oh, hold on. There we go. So the motivation for this presentation is a little bit to stir the pot a little and get people thinking about the opportunities that have been presented as a result of the past year, rather than the challenges that have been presented. And on that note, it's actually my aim not to say COVID once during the brief, well, I guess other than that. So let's see how I do. For this presentation, what I've done is I've made some observations and grouped some of the assumptions that I've made in the past year into 4 themes. And those 4 themes are assumptions about meeting spaces in distributed wargames, timing, communication, and design. There's some very broad generalizations, some observations that I'm going to be making, and in order to discuss some of the challenges that we can make, or how to challenge some of those assumptions often made about wargaming in the distributed era. So I'll be speaking to each of these themes in the following slides, and would also like to challenge those assumptions by noting innovation and tools which can help us move forward. So here are some of those broad generalizations that I've mentioned. So meeting space, the idea that wargaming should take place in person, that's what's normal and should always be the case. Further, that timing, and this actually complements Louise's presentation quite well, because I would also like to challenge the idea that virtual wargaming takes longer, something that we see quite often, an observation that people often make. So I'd like to challenge that. I'd also like to look at communication as a theme and how most I think that it's more difficult online. And then finally, that as a result of the above factors, that game design is now different. So moving right in here, let's look at the first assumption. So here we have some of the broad generalizations of some of the assumptions that I've seen take place about wargaming meeting spaces and player engagement. So first, we have that wargaming should take place in person, i.e. that's what's normal, that they offer more versatility, and that they're easier to facilitate. Now I'd like to go through some counter offers to challenge these, starting with how distributed wargaming has benefited distributed organizations, as we've heard from a couple of our panelists already in this conference. So, for example, yesterday we heard a great brief from Lieutenant Colonel Cole Peterson, who brought us through how we wargamed the vaccine rollout here in Canada with Rex at the helm with DRDC support. In a very short amount of time, we were able to pull together experts from 13 provinces and territories, 8 federal government departments, and the Red Cross, with over 150 people in attendance from across the country. Now, we were able to do that in a distributed manner in a country as large as Canada because we rapidly embraced distributed gaming from the outset and had the ability to rapidly put together that meeting space. And that wouldn't have been able to happen otherwise. Now, further to that, another challenge, the idea that wargaming should take place in person. I'll note that distributed gaming gives us the opportunity to get subject matter experts in the room easier than we would have been able to for in-person gaming. And I think that that's very valuable and something that is often overlooked. And Louise brought this up in her presentation, the idea that she doesn't have to drive the 2 hours to Brussels anymore, and that speaks to cost as well. For facilitators, with the right technology, you can indeed, I think, read the room. There are technology solutions out there. It just takes trial and error to find the right way to be able to do this. And finally, challenging those assumptions, we should always be thinking about the needs of the war game. Does it actually require you to be in the same room? It requires designers to think about technology solutions ahead of time now, instead of diverting to the default in-person mode. So finally, timing, the idea that virtual wargaming takes longer by virtue of the online meeting space and tools which the control team of players must interact with. And into the distributed space, what I mean by a control team is, of course, the facilitator, and then other members of the support staff, and a dedicated technology specialist or IT person to be able to, and note takers to be able to capture data and deal with problems as they show up. So that's what I mean by control team. So in here we have, and this was kind of the impetus for my presentation title, I think you're on mute. This speaks to things like connection issues, muting, unmuting, technical briefs, etc. But I think at its heart, regardless of whether or not a game is distributed, it's about prudent preparation, which does require some additional work pre-game. But once you've laid the foundations for that, each subsequent game becomes easier to design and to run. So if you look at some of those, there's play testing, read-ahead packages, technical briefs, and connection rehearsals. These are some of the things that I found actually reduces some of the time of war games, or can reduce the time that war games take place. Play testing is obviously very important, as are read-ahead packages. Now you have to be able to do that ahead of time in a timely manner. So again, it does require a little bit more work ahead of time. What's very important here are the technical briefs. So what we found is that it's very easy to just send people brief joining instructions, but then complement that with a set of technical instructions which will help them overcome some of those connection issues. And having pre-defined kind of breakout rooms almost, where you can push people over there to deal with IT issues and then bring them back in. So, the idea that virtual wargamings take longer, it's just really about your preparation. Your tools should be fit for purpose, and they should complement gameplay. And if you look at the graphic on the right there, there's really not that much different about that in a distributed game versus an in-person game. It's all about that preparation. It's about testing, reforming, testing, executing, and repeat. It should always be a work in progress. As long as you continue to refine that, I don't think that war games typically have to be longer if they're done in a virtual space. So here we have some assumptions about communicating during distributed games. So the idea that it's difficult to transmit information either during or ahead of time. that it's a slow format, that it's one-on-one. And lots of the critiques that I've heard focus on this area and note that the human-to-human interface is just too hard to replicate. So the idea that if you look at the graphic on the right, that the facilitator needs to talk to players who need to talk to the control team who needs to talk to the facilitator. That is very possible to do in a virtual manner. It, again, just takes a lot of trial and error to figure out the right tool set that will enable that function. There's also the assumption that, and we hear this one a lot, and I've heard it even a lot in the chat and the discussions that have taken place, the idea that those backroom one-on-one secret discussions can no longer really take place, where I don't think that that's the case. You just need, the right tools to make that happen. And again, you're going to hear me say that, I think, over and over again, is that it's all about the tool set that you pick. And not only that, I found that there's often richer discussion as a result of the additional people that you're able to get into the room on short notice. Research is at everyone's fingertips. It's easy to get experts in the room, and which all of those things combined allows for more factors to be brought into a war game. There's several lines of communication to choose through, whether it be voice, text, visual, or a mixture. It could be apps. We had a great demonstration from Tom at the outset of this panel, which even has graphics and pop-ups, and the extent to which you can interact in a virtual realm doesn't have to be limited by our imaginations. So all of that leads up to my last theme, which is game design. And this refers to each of the previous discussions about meeting spaces, timing, and communication, and how there's an assumption, I think, that they all affect game design disproportionately when gaming in a distributed manner. And to unpack that a little, I'd like to challenge that by noting that while what games look like have changed, the design practices should not have. And that's why I like to challenge this point quite a bit. And that's why I saved this one for last. Because what I mean by this is that distributed game design is not about should not be about just reverse engineering old practices to fit new challenges. We shouldn't be trying to fit square pegs in round holes. At their core, if we peel apart everything, war games are meant to address particular problems and challenges using innovative methods. If you're working in a defense institution, it's what is the military problem that you're trying to address? And to address that, design has always been about applying principles to game design ahead of time, and distributed games should be no different, even though their form has changed. So the design of the game should always follow from need. So for example, to address those problems and challenges that you're trying to wargame, you should always try to think out of the box and consider what tools are out there to support in your endeavor, which could mean even moving beyond the die and more traditional forms of wargaming that we see in person. And I think that Tom's demonstration at the outset of this panel, again, really demonstrated that very well. So wrapping up with a couple of my own observations, kind of brought forth from the past year of distributed gaming. I've noted that there are, and I don't think that this is really unique to distributed games, but perhaps more prevalent in this era, but there are helpful and unhelpful ways about thinking about wargaming. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, game design naturally follows from considering the problem or questions being asked before anything else, and that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to wargaming, and that we should not treat them as such. Each virtual war game will necessarily require bespoke tool sets, which does require additional work in the design process, but it shouldn't affect the process itself. It shouldn't create extra steps or what have you. All of this to say is that there's often a tendency to gravitate toward familiar solutions to new problems, and that we should continue to challenge that, especially now. So I'll leave you with some concluding thoughts, maybe some thought-provoking questions for the question period. As I've discussed, and so have others before me, there are many benefits to wargaming online. So I do not think that distributed wargaming should be regarded as a temporary solution. Instead, I think that assumptions about distributed gaming, or rather wargaming in general, should be challenged to evolve wargaming moving forward. And I'll leave you with a question about whether or not a complete return to in-person gaming is necessary, or whether some of the experience that we've gained in the past year can be used to refine and adapt wargaming in the future. And so with that, I will pass it back to you, Tom.